Welcome to Angular Orange and our course on promises. Okay, first we're going to introduce promises. What is a promise? It is a placeholder for a future value based on an asynchronous computation. Usually it resolves to one or two results. Either you get a result, that is, we came through on our promise, or we get an error because we had trouble coming through on that promise. In both cases, the promise is said to be resolved. So there's three states. First, it's pending, that is, it's unresolved, or it could be fulfilled, in which case it's resolved, or it can be rejected, or we can throw an error. Now, if you look to the right here, these are the promise states. Basically, you with a promise you do something. Let's suppose I say I make a web service call, and I'm waiting for that result, and I'm waiting to come through for that with that result. So there's two resolved states. One is the promise is fulfilled, in which case I got data back from the web service, and in the other state it got rejected, and there's a reason. Maybe the network was down or something. So there's always one state. Once you hit a fulfilled state, you can't go to a rejected state. Once you hit a rejected state, you can't flip to a fulfilled state. You're in one of these states, and then the promise is said to be resolved. Okay, so let's take a look at a promise. Okay, so the promise constructor looks like this. You let my promise equal new promise. You instantiate a promise with a new operator, and it immediately invokes the function that's passed in. So basically, what I do is I define a function with a resolve and reject. And inside my function, I resolve it with the data that I'm promising, or I reject it because some error occurred and there's no way I could fulfill the promise. So first what we do in the promise, we do a console.log, my promise is executing. And you'll see that logged when I instantiate the promise. And then I do a set timeout, and basically I use the fat arrow operator to define an anonymous a function which gets invoked after 2 seconds. So after 2 seconds, I do a console.log resolving my promise, and then I resolve the promise by saying you got a successful result. So I'm resolving after 2,000 milliseconds. Now what I do after that, if I want that result and I want to log it, let's say, I do a myPromise.then. That sets up a callback to be invoked when the promise resolves. And when I get that result, I use the fat arrow operator and an anonymous function to basically take that string and log it with the console.log saying we received a string, okay? And the string value will appear. So the output of this particular function code would basically say, first it would say my promise is executing, then the timeout expires, and we basically log resolving my promise, and then in the callback I log successful result. Okay, so let's go through a simple example which looks at the promise, and I'll show you some interesting things about it. Okay, so here my code is running here. I basically went into my project and I did an np start, and that invoked an ng serve, and eventually I got it compiling. And now my code is compiling on the fly whenever I change my code. So now I'm at the point here where I've done a little bit of testing. And there's a lot of transpiling that was happening. Also, I wanted to show you that I did an ng space v to see what version I'm using with my example, and I'm using Angular 5.1.1. So I know what I'm dealing with here, and let's take a look at the application code that I'm running. Okay, the application code I'm running is an application which has a simple root component. And basically what I do inside of the template is I display a flexbox full of button actions in a row-oriented fashion, which invoke functions that exhibit my particular examples. So, for example, let's take a look at our application code. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go into presentation mode. And I'll take a look at my Angular JSON file. I have a project called Promises, and I have an index with a style sheet. And so what I do is I look at that right away, and I have an app root component, and basically I have a style which has the background being a deep sky blue, and then I have a main driver which loads an app module from app module and bootstraps it using the platform browser dynamic. So basically that app module is the thing that's really running my app, and what I do is look at that and I say, well, this thing essentially is just bootstrapping my root component, and I have to declare my custom component, I have to bootstrap my root component. So it's a very simple example. And now I look at the root component, and I have an annotation of component associated with my export app component class. That's what turns it into a component. And then I have a selector, an external template, an external style. And basically what I'm going to do is look at my simplest example. I have a constructor which gets invoked to create my instance. And I have this method called simplest. And this method simplest does begin simplest, and it has the code that I just had on the slide. We instantiate a promise, and then as soon as we do that, we pass in a function that immediately gets executed. And we log my promises executing. We have a set timeout. After 2 seconds, the console.log resolving promise happens, and we resolve with a successful result. And then we call a callback, which gets called after the promise is resolved. And in that scenario, we pass the string to a fat arrow operator and anonymous function, and basically we log that we received a string. Now, the important thing I want to show you here is that I log the beginning of the function and the end of the function, but we're executing asynchronous code here. So let's take a look at the template. In the template, what I do is I just have a button, and upon user click, I invoke the simplest function of my object instance. Everything else is just a title. Here I use the interpolation operator to get the title. What's the title? Demo of Promises. and then I logged the Angular logo, and I changed the size of it so it's a little smaller. And I also styled this div tag with some classes actions. Let's see what I did here. I put the actions here and I made them light green. My div tag is my main class. I don't know. I used the main here up in the div. So basically, what I did was call that light sky blue. And I introduced some sizes so things were spaced out right. And notice I use a display flex and the flex wrap. And without knowing too much, I could pretty much lay out my buttons in a row. So in this particular container, I do lay out in a row, and that's why things are showing up so nicely. Okay, so let's take a look at the function example. Looks like it retranspiled. So this was the method that I was invoking. So it begins simplest. It says promise is executing. The function call ended, and then asynchronously the promise was resolved due to the set timeout. It was resolving the promise. Then the resolve function was called, and then we did a then on the promise, and the callback was called, and we got this received successful result. Let's see it again. So when I first put the logging in for begin function, end function, I wanted to put boundaries around my logging so I see, where this function is logging, but it doesn't work. Let's just try to see whether there is anything we can do about that, but I won't change the example. Let's suppose I changed this to 200 milliseconds. Let's see what happens with that. It still doesn't really matter. So let's go back and take a look and see why this is happening once more. This executes. This promise executes the function, which basically submits a set timeout. Now there's a lag when I submit timeout, so we know the function. We know this function is going to continue executing. And this is getting logged here, even though that this promise function has executed asynchronously, even though this set timeout is timed for executing after 2 seconds, even though this promise is a callback waiting for this result, this function completes executing, and all this asynchronous stuff happens after this gets logged. So this function cannot end until this statement is executed. Okay, one more time. Okay, so that completes our first example, using the most simplest structure of a promise that you could try to use. Now keep in mind that I could have done anything here. I could have called a web service waiting for a result. And also I want to point out that typically what I do most of the time is I'm calling a web service waiting for an asynchronous result. And when it happens, I am trying to set some state of the component, and then I could use the interpolation operator to show that result. So I'm trying to keep my example really simple and not introduce too much template rendering and stuff like that with directives. And I'm just showing you the log of what's happening. But after we receive a successful result, the front end could change, because I could change the state and change detection, property binding, etc. would happen. Okay, so let's move on to the second part of the course.